Imagine standing in the middle of a barren Texas field in 1920, the sun beating down on cracked earth, wind swirling dust around your boots, and knowing that every dollar you once had is gone. Your friends have vanished, the newspapers have stopped printing your name, and the world has moved on. You are 47 years old, a man who once touched the heights of wealth, power, and ambition, and now, forgotten. That was the life of Harry Sinclair. Born in 1876, Sinclair grew up in a world of relentless ambition. He didn't inherit oil fortunes, diamonds, or silver spoons. He inherited something far rarer, a restless mind that could see black gold where others saw only dirt. By the 1910s, he had carved a path through the chaotic, wild oil fields of Oklahoma, building a network of refineries, pipelines, and companies that whispered his name among the elite. Yet for all his brilliance, fortune was a fickle companion, and ambition can be a dangerous friend. Close your eyes and picture the streets of early 20th century America. Horse-drawn wagons rattling past crude wooden storefronts, newspapers screaming about oil strikes and stock markets, young men dreaming of riches, shaking hands in dusty offices. Sinclair moved among them like a shadow with a vision, a man who knew the risks but was willing to gamble everything. He built an empire not just with money, but with audacity, charm, and the kind of relentless energy that left lesser men gasping in his wake. And yet, despite the power, the wealth, and the headlines, the world would turn its back on him. By the roaring 1920s, Sinclair's empire would be caught in a storm of scandal, political intrigue, and public outrage. The same hands that lifted him to the top would claw him down, leaving him a symbol of both the heights of ambition and the peril of daring too much. So here he stood, at the crossroads of history, a man who had risked everything for the promise of oil, for the thrill of enterprise, and for a place in America's memory. Only the memory forgot him. And now we must ask ourselves, would you have kept going if you were him? Picture a young Harry Sinclair in the 1890s walking along dusty streets in Ohio, eyes wide with curiosity but fists clenched with determination. Money was scarce, opportunities were scarcer. His family wasn't wealthy, they were ordinary, cautious, tethered to small-town life. But Harry, he didn't want ordinary. Ordinary was a cage, and he had fire in his veins that refused to be contained. He started small. Odd jobs. Laboring on railroads, hauling barrels, anything that paid. But he studied people as closely as he studied numbers. He observed who succeeded, who failed, and why. He watched seasoned oilmen drill, negotiate, and bluff, absorbing lessons that would later define his empire. Every failure, every scraped knee or missed deal became fuel. And yet the weight of obscurity pressed on him like an invisible hand, reminding him constantly that ambition alone wasn't enough. By the early 1900s, Harry had moved to Oklahoma, where oil was no longer a dream, but a living, breathing force. The oil fields were chaotic, lawless, and brutal. Men gambled fortunes on a single strike. Companies rose and fell in months. And Sinclair? He was learning fast. He faced sabotage from rivals, deceptive land deals, and pipelines that leaked both oil and trust. Every step forward seemed shadowed by potential disaster. There was one night in particular that haunted him for years, a strike that should have made him wealthy but ended in disaster. He had invested everything in a well near Bartlesville. The team worked for days, sweat and smoke thick in the air. And then, the well blew prematurely, spewing oil into the sky and into bankruptcy. He watched his savings vanish, felt the sting of ridicule from men who once admired him. And yet, he didn't quit. Some men would have bowed under that humiliation. Not Harry. He swallowed the pain, studied the mistake, and made a quiet vow. He would return, stronger and smarter. By now, the oil fields had begun to recognize him, not yet for greatness, but for resilience. For a man who didn't just chase wealth, but who calculated risk, embraced the chaos, and learned faster than the world could punish him. Friends were few, enemies many. Sleep was scarce, but every sleepless night, every whispered insult from competitors, every shattered investment carved him into someone formidable, someone who understood that in oil and in life, the greatest gains come not from luck, but from audacity paired with relentless strategy. And just as he began to rise again, a storm was forming on the horizon, one that would test his genius, his courage, and his very soul. It was 1907. Harry Sinclair had scraped together every dollar, every ounce of credibility, and a ragtag team of men who believed in his vision. They were heading into the Oklahoma oil fields again, where every patch of land was a gamble and every drill could mean triumph or ruin. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and anticipation. For Sinclair, this wasn't just a business deal. It was a declaration. He would not be forgotten, not now, not ever. The drilling was slow, brutal. Days bled into nights, and the men's hands were raw, their spirits frayed. Sinclair wandered among them, sleeves rolled up, boots caked in mud, never showing fear, but carrying every ounce of tension himself. Each day was a test, each swing of the drill a heartbeat that could either lift him to glory or crush him completely. At night, he would sit alone by a flickering lantern, poring over maps, contracts, and geological surveys. He couldn't afford mistakes. One wrong choice could ruin not only him, but the families of every man who trusted him. Then, one evening, just as the horizon bled into a fiery sunset, a tremor shook the rig. The team held their breath. Oil began to surge, black, relentless, miraculous. The first strike. For Sinclair, it was intoxicating. Years of struggle, humiliation, and doubt poured into that single moment. Men cheered, but Harry didn't celebrate immediately. He stood there, silent, almost afraid to touch reality. Was this real? Could it last? Or would fate, as it always had, pull the rug out from under him once more? That well changed everything. Investors began to notice. Fortune began to follow him like a shadow. He expanded rapidly. Pipelines, refineries, even banks, each venture riskier than the last, each deal a delicate dance on the edge of catastrophe. Yet for all the success, Sinclair carried a private burden. Nights were sleepless, haunted by the memory of Fayette. Lure, the guilt of men who had lost everything following his lead, and the constant whisper of doubt, it could all disappear tomorrow. The exhilaration of triumph was inseparable from fear. Every handshake in a boardroom was charged with tension. Every new deal was a gamble with human lives and reputations at stake. Sinclair had become not just a businessman, but a tightrope walker over an abyss of his own making. And he loved it. The danger, the stakes, the thrill, it was intoxicating. He had tasted power, and power demanded more, always more. But the world has a way of testing even the boldest. In the shadows of his victories, whispers began to rise of political enemies, of federal scrutiny, of alliances that were fragile as glass. The stakes were about to shift from financial to existential, from opportunity to peril. And Sinclair, brilliant as he was, could not yet see how high the price of ambition could climb. Because sometimes, the very thing that makes a man untouchable also makes him a target. By the early 1920s, Harry Sinclair wasn't just an oil man. He was a symbol of ambition itself. Men whispered his name in awe, but also with suspicion. His empire stretched across states, pipelines carved like veins through the earth, and refineries churned day and night. But every empire casts a shadow, and Sinclair's was about to grow dark. The first cracks came quietly. Politicians began to murmur, newspapers began to pry, and competitors, those who had once envied him, started to scheme. Sinclair had always thrived on risk, but this was a different game. This wasn't a gamble in a field or a deal on paper. This was a storm of public opinion, legal scrutiny, and moral outrage, and it moved faster than any oil gusher. It began with whispers about favoritism and unfair advantages, hints that Sinclair's influence reached into the halls of power. By the time it hit the front pages, the public's fascination had turned to suspicion. Editorials accused him of manipulating markets, of deals that benefited him while ordinary Americans suffered. And the most damaging charge of all, allegations that he had conspired to cheat the government itself. For a man who had built his life on boldness and vision, this was different. This was betrayal, not by rivals, but by the very society he had helped fuel with his oil. Yet Sinclair didn't crumble. Not at first. He fought back with the same audacity that had brought him fame. He held meetings in smoke-filled rooms, whispered strategies with loyal executives, and kept pipelines flowing while lawyers danced in courts. But the pressure was relentless. Friends vanished, fearful of association. Sleep became a stranger. Every letter, every telegram, every knock at the office door carried potential ruin. The empire he had built with sweat, intelligence, and daring was now a house of cards trembling in the wind. And in private, Sinclair wrestled, head with something deeper, the cost of ambition. He had risked everything to rise above ordinary, to seize the life most men only dreamed of. But the higher he climbed, the lonelier the summit became. He saw faces of those who trusted him, employees, partners, even family, tainted by the fallout of his choices. And for the first time, the thrill of power was shadowed by the ache of responsibility. Yet in that ache, in that quiet tension, something remarkable emerged. Sinclair realized that risk was never just about wealth. Risk was about courage, about daring to face the storm knowing it could destroy you. And he began to prepare, not just to survive, but to strike back in a way that history would remember. The storm was coming, and Sinclair knew that when it broke he would have to make a choice that could either restore his empire or bury him forever. It was 1924, and Harry Sinclair was standing at the edge of a precipice, metaphorical and real. The empire he had built with blood, sweat, and sleepless nights teetered under scandal. The media called it a conspiracy, rivals whispered of his ruin, and the government's gaze was relentless. Yet in the private chambers of his mind, Sinclair saw only one path forward: risk everything or vanish into obscurity. He decided to push harder than anyone had ever dared. Sinclair orchestrated what would later become infamously known as the Teapot Dome scandal, maneuvering oil reserves in Wyoming and California in secret deals that would fuel his companies, and, in his mind, secure America's energy future. Every handshake carried weight, every signed document a potential sentence. He was playing chess at a scale few could comprehend, each move calculated, yet each move terrifyingly precarious. Picture him in a smoke-filled office, the lamp casting long shadows on his face, papers scattered like battlefield maps, advisors nervous, sweating under pressure, daring not to breathe too loudly. Sinclair leaned over the desk, eyes cold but blazing with focus, knowing that one misstep could send him not just to bankruptcy, but to prison. He made decisions that ordinary men would call reckless. He signed agreements, transferred funds, and whispered assurances that danced dangerously close to illegality. Every action was a heartbeat away from disaster. And yet, there was a fire in him that no fear could quench. He believed in the audacity of his vision. To Sinclair, these weren't crimes, they were bold moves in a world that rewarded daring. The oil would flow, the empire would survive, and he would emerge unbroken, or so he hoped. The tension was unbearable. Weeks turned into months as investigations quietly started to circle. Journalists sniffed, senators whispered, and Sinclair, for all his brilliance, knew the inevitable was approaching, a confrontation that would test not only his business acumen but his very identity as a man of vision. He didn't flinch, he doubled down. He poured resources into operations, ensured loyal allies were in key positions, and faced rivals with a calm that belied the storm. To the outside world, he appeared untouchable, but inside, his heart raced. Every decision, every contract, every oil barrel represented the razor's edge between triumph and annihilation. And then it happened. The public discovered the scandal. Headlines screamed betrayal. Political enemies roared. And suddenly the man who had once seemed untouchable was under the harshest scrutiny of his life. For the first time, Harry Sinclair confronted the truth. Ambition carries a cost, and sometimes the highest risks demand more than courage. They demand survival against forces you cannot control. He had gambled everything. The question now wasn't if he would fall, it was how he would rise again. The world turned against Harry Sinclair as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Headlines screamed his name like a verdict. Senators questioned him. Friends disappeared. The oil king, once untouchable, now faced the cold, harsh truth. Wealth and audacity could not shield him from scandal. Yet amidst the humiliation, there was a strange clarity. Sinclair felt it deep in his chest. the pulse of a man who had faced ruin before and survived. He was battered, yes, but not broken. In private, he wandered the halls of his empty office, gazing at walls adorned with maps of pipelines, stock charts, and contracts. These symbols of past triumphs now mocked him. The laughter of rivals, the whispers of betrayal, the judgment of society, it all pressed down, suffocating, relentless. But Sinclair was a man who had learned a secret. When the world expects you to crumble, your choices define whether you vanish or return stronger. He retreated strategically, not into obscurity but into planning. Meetings were held quietly, far from the public eye. Alliances were rebuilt. Legal battles were fought with precision. Every action was measured, every decision a calculated step to regain control. Behind the scenes, Sinclair transformed his humiliation into focus. The humiliation was not weakness, it was a crucible, forging patience, resilience, and a sharper mind. Meanwhile, he observed the oil industry with renewed clarity. Rivals, now emboldened by his scandal, made mistakes, overextending, miscalculating, and underestimating the depth of Sinclair's understanding. He capitalized silently, quietly acquiring assets at bargain prices, strengthening the parts of his empire that scandal couldn't touch. There was a poetic rhythm to it. While others celebrated his downfall, he quietly prepared for resurgence. Emotionally, Sinclair wrestled with his identity. Was he merely an oil man, a gambler, or something more? He realized that ambition was not just about wealth. It was about legacy, influence, and the courage to take risks when every heartbeat screamed caution. Each night he replayed the choices that had led him here, learning, recalibrating, and burning every lesson into memory. And slowly, like dawn breaking over the plains, the first signs of his comeback appeared. Deals that once seemed impossible now bent in his favor. Allies returned, drawn by his vision and his tenacity. Even the public began to soften, recognizing that scandal alone could not erase decades of ingenuity. Harry Sinclair had fallen, yes, but the fall was not final. It was a turning point, a psychological awakening. He had been stripped of illusions, exposed to fear, and tested to the core. And as any man who has faced ruin knows, the road to redemption begins with a single, fearless step forward. By the late 1920s, Harry Sinclair was no longer the scandalized oil man the headlines had condemned. He had survived, yes, but more importantly, he had transformed. The experience of near destruction had reshaped him. Where once he had acted with reckless audacity, now he moved with calculated courage, a man who understood that true power is not just in wealth, but in timing, perception, and the mastery of human nature. Sinclair's comeback was not loud. It was quiet, precise, and almost invisible to the masses. While the world focused on sensational stories, he rebuilt pipelines, purchased strategic refineries, and quietly reclaimed influence in Washington and Wall Street. Every acquisition, every deal, was a silent statement. I am not finished. I am not weak. I am still here. Emotionally, this period was the hardest, yet most rewarding. Sinclair had learned that vulnerability is not weakness. Facing public scorn, betrayal, and legal peril forced him to confront the most intimate truths about ambition, trust, and resilience. He understood now that a legacy is not just built in moments of triumph, but also in how a man responds to devastation. The shame, the isolation, the doubt, they became teachers rather than enemies. He also began mentoring younger entrepreneurs, quietly passing on lessons no textbook could teach. He taught them the psychology of risk, the necessity of moral calculation, and the relentless courage required to rise when the world seems to conspire against you. Sinclair's empire was smaller than its peak, but it was wiser, more resilient, and built to endure. And yet, despite the victories, there was a haunting truth. History is selective. Newspapers had moved on, books had omitted his name, and public memory often forgets those who fall from grace. Harry Sinclair's life became a paradox. Famous in his time, almost invisible to the generations that followed. But in the quiet of his offices, in the hum of his refineries, and in the lessons he left behind, his influence endured. This comeback was not merely financial, it was psychological. Sinclair had reclaimed mastery over his fears, his reputation, and his destiny. He had proven that a man can rise again, even when the world believes he is defeated. Every sleepless night, every whispered threat, every public condemnation had forged a mind capable of enduring the unimaginable and emerging not only intact, but stronger. And as he looked across the horizon of his oil fields, Sinclair must have known, true legacy is not written in the applause of the world, but in the courage to rise when the world is against you. The question that lingers is both haunting and inspiring. Harry Sinclair died in 1956, a man who had once commanded the oil fields of America, whose name had been whispered in boardrooms, shouted in newspapers, and feared by rivals. And yet today, few remember him. His story, full of triumph, scandal, and resilience, is buried beneath the gloss of more celebrated tycoons. But perhaps that is fitting. Because Sinclair's life was never about fame, it was about courage, audacity, and the willingness to risk everything for something bigger than oneself. Imagine the weight he carried in those days of scandal, the glare of public condemnation, the threat of jail, the betrayal of allies, the gnawing fear that his life's work might vanish overnight. And yet, even then, he made choices that others could not. He faced ruin and did not bend. He stared fear in the face and answered with action. He taught, without intending to, that the heart of ambition is not safety, it is risk. Sinclair's legacy is not in the headlines or the history books. It is in the lessons etched into the minds of those who dare to dream, those who refuse to surrender to failure, and those who understand that every empire, no matter how high, rests on the thin edge of courage. He reminds us that success is as much about surviving calamity as it is about seizing opportunity. And here is the question that hangs over every one of us, the one that keeps ambition alive. If life tested you like it tested him, if everything you built were suddenly at risk, would you have kept fighting? Could you endure humiliation, betrayal, and the shadow of public scorn and still take the next bold step? Tell me in the comments, would you have taken that risk? Would you have walked into the storm when everyone else was fleeing? Because in the quiet courage of men like Harry Sinclair we find the truth. The greatest victories are not the ones remembered by history, but the ones forged, in silence, under pressure, and against the odds. He may have been forgotten by the world, but his story, his audacity, his mistakes, his comebacks, still whispers to those brave enough to listen.